Just to be sure. Carl, which last slides are sharing?
I will share the right topic one. Hi, everybody.
Oh,
Welcome to this session on saving groups over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we will wait a few minutes to give people the chance to join before we start sharing our presentations. Hello, everybody. We will start. Um, I Thanks everybody for joining this session about savings groups and member resilience over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Thomas de Hoop. I'm a managing economist in the International Development Division at the American Institutes for Research. I'm joined here by colleagues from CARE International and Makerere University, Uganda. I will let them introduce themselves, but I think we can start and I will start sharing my screen at the beginning of this session, and then Call will start presenting. So just give me 1 minute while I'm sharing my screen, and then Call will take over. Okay, we will wait a few minutes for people to join. Okay, we can quickly introduce ourselves. calls, I think. Call, do you want to start?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us to our session. I will start by introducing myself. My name is Kalkidan, and I'm the coordinator of Women Respond Initiative with CARE International. And I'm based in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa. And I'll pass it to Eve to introduce herself.
Thank you, Carl. My name is Eve Namisango, and I'm a member of the Evidence Consortium on Women Groups in Uganda and affiliated to the College of Health Sciences, Makerere University, Africa Center for Systematic Reviews and Knowledge Translation. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eve. I'm called Tabitha Mulyampiti. I teach gender studies in Makerere University, but I'm also a member of the Evidence Consortium on Women Groups in Uganda. I welcome all of you.
Okay, thanks all. My name is Thomas. I'm a managing economist at the American Institute for Research and the co-principal investigator for the Evidence Consortium on Women's Groups. I will start sharing my screen also right now, and then I will give the floor to Carl after that.
All right. Thank you, Thomas. So, as Thomas introduced the topic today, we are sharing findings from saving groups from Nigeria and Uganda based on the quantitative and qualitative findings we have over a course of 12 months in 2021 and in 2022. And we talk about the resilience over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So we've already introduced ourselves, so we can skip this slide. I want to start by giving a brief introduction about the initiative. It's called Women Respond, and Women Respond is a CARE initiative that was launched with the start of the pandemic. And with the start of the COVID pandemic at CARE, there were various rapid gender analysis and assessment to show the gender impact of the pandemic. And Women Respond was initiated to bring in what women across the world were telling us about the effect of the pandemic in their lives, in their households, and what they're doing to adapt and cope and respond to the pandemic, and what their priority needs are. And this was done with the aim and the objective to bring in women's voices to the national and global stage to influence an inclusive COVID-19 response and recovery decisions. Next slide, please. So under the broader Women Respond that I just talked about, we have been implementing the Women in VSLA Respond sub-initiative in the last 2 years. And this was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and targeting 6 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And the main focus was members of Village and Saving and Loan Association, which short term is VSLAs. And the aim was to understand, in addition to some of the individual and household level challenges they faced as a result of the pandemic, in addition to their individual priority needs and response, we wanted to understand how they are affected as a group, how they're adapting some of their group function, what role saving groups are playing collectively in local responses and in supporting their members as well, and what priority needs they have, what support they need from different actors. And to do that, we collaborated with the Evidence Consortium on Women's Group and the American Institute for Research to jointly conduct the study in Nigeria and Uganda. And our session today focused on the findings from these 2 countries. Next slide, please. So the main objectives of Women Respond is threefold. One, by getting the learnings and data, and by listening to women's voices, Women Respond aimed at improving CARE's programming and our engagement with saving groups. And we also wanted to use the findings to influence the program of our partners so that we can effectively address what women are telling us. Part of Women Respond process is also getting the data and the finding back to the women, the VSLA groups, and the community at large. And this was done to support women's local leadership and their activism and leadership. So they were part of the audience of the learning and the data itself. Additionally, by getting evidence to different government and donors, local government and national government, Women Respond was designed to influence decision makers to support VSLAs in their COVID response and COVID recovery mechanisms. Next slide, please. So I want to highlight some of the key summary finding, which will be discussed in detail by the co-presenters in a few minutes. So one of the key findings we're seeing across the countries is due to the pandemic, individual saving rates are lower compared to the rate of saving people have before the pandemic. And majority of them are trying to continue their group saving and their VSLA saving, but part of the quantitative survey and also the qualitative insight are showing that savings are highly disrupted and they're often irregular. And people are often saving less than they used to. And their access to credit is also limited. And one of the main driving factor for this is livelihood and income challenges. Income and livelihood are among the most affected areas that respondents reported throughout the data collection. And due to the pandemic restriction and the market disruption, respondents are also dealing with not just only COVID, but other shocks as well. So the compounded effect of this different shocks, including COVID, is eroding their livelihood. And members may require support, such as cash transfers and vouchers and food aid. Majority of them ask it as livelihood as their biggest need and the support area that they want to be able to access. But despite the challenge that we're seeing in terms of livelihood, lower saving, and so on, we saw a huge action by saving group members, especially women. Particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, they took action in their communities. They disseminated information about COVID. They collectively constructed hand washing centers in their communities. They engaged in different community mobilization mechanisms. As a group, VSLAs, they're also put an effort to adapt their meeting processes, their saving, their loan, and they as much as possible, they try to continue to meet. And over time, the survey shows that in Nigeria, we're seeing inconsistent improvement where more respondents are reporting to resume their meeting as before the pandemic. In Uganda, the majority are meeting in adapted form still. So I'll stop here. Thank you for listening, and I will pass it to Thomas to share the methodology and the quantitative finding. Over to you, Thomas.
I'm just also unmuting myself because I realized that I can only do that without my screen shared. Wait, what can you see now? Okay. So thanks, Carl, for this introduction. I'm going to speak a little bit about the methods we used for this overview before I dive into the findings. So we essentially used two types of methods. We started at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, shortly after March 2020, beginning in April 2020, and in the second half and entering into the second half of 2022, with an evidence synthesis of findings of various studies on women's groups and COVID-19. And basically what we did is we stayed up to date on the evidence, and like while the pandemic was going on, we live updated this evidence synthesis. And these are just some of the highlights of the things we included in the evidence synthesis. Like one thing is a survey among 433 Catholic Relief Services supported savings groups in sub-Saharan Africa. We also included analysis of phone-based surveys on the functioning of savings groups. Some of those were conducted by academics, others were conducted by organizations such as CARE, and I think Call herself was involved in some of those as well. We also included qualitative data on savings groups functioning and resilience, as well as, and we combined all of that also with some of our own analysis. The Living Standards Measurement Survey in Nigeria and Uganda both had in-person data from before the pandemic, and we were able to merge those data with 4 rounds of phone-based survey data in a close to nationally representative sample, with the caveat that that national representativeness was limited because of course, the phone-based surveys could only be done with people who owned phones. This is an evidence synthesis, but we combined all of this also with a separate evidence synthesis of women's groups and past shocks that are comparable to COVID-19. This included, for example, Ebola, as well as weather shocks, for example. Basically, the inclusion criteria were such that we included shocks that had large implications for entire countries or entire regions. And over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, we also started doing some of our own research. And Carl already introduced this, this was part of the Women Respond initiative. We focused on Nigeria and Uganda with the Evidence Consortium on Women's Groups in particular, and that is where this presentation is about. We collected longitudinal data every 3 months, starting in 2021, in the beginning of 2021. And we collected data in Nigeria and Uganda. And what you can see in this is that in total, we started with 1,607 respondents in Nigeria and 971 respondents in Uganda. And attrition was notably higher in Uganda, but ultimately we ended up with 1,471 respondents in Nigeria who answered 4 surveys and 634 respondents in Uganda who answered 4 surveys. Multitude of reasons for why the attrition rate in Uganda was higher, among others because people switched phone numbers quite often. We combined all of this with 2 rounds of in-depth qualitative interviews with 68 respondents from Nigeria and Uganda. And of those qualitative interviews, the first round was a phone interview, and the second round was an in-person interview. And it was mostly because during the first round, we were still very careful when it came to social distancing. Also during the second round, but then we felt more comfortable already doing some in-person surveys or in-person interviews, I must say. So I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into some of the quantitative findings that Carl already introduced. And Carl already mentioned that changes in income and livelihoods were among the challenges that were most visible both in Nigeria and Uganda. A large percentage of respondents really highlighted how income and livelihoods were some of the most affected areas during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is most likely because of the lockdown. And some of this we can see also when we actually compare the 2 countries. What we see is that in Uganda in particularly, that income and livelihoods during the first survey round was pretty important, with 28% of the respondents actually highlighting how important this was for them in comparison with some of the other areas that were among the choices. But during the 4th round, which was actually done a little bit more recently, when people started getting vaccinated, and there was while the pandemic continued, there was somewhat less concern. At that point, income and livelihoods were less affected. And the way we interpret this is also because in Uganda in particular, there was a lot of social distancing and there were a lot of restrictions with multiple lockdowns also across the country. And like those lockdowns could have had very strong effects on income or livelihoods. And this is also what we see in some other research done by other researchers as well. The pattern was very different in Nigeria, actually. And this is actually where we see that income and livelihoods were actually among the most affected, particularly in the last survey. And this is where we also see that, like, in the data, that like a large variety of shocks, compounding crisis, actually affect these participants. It started with the COVID-19 pandemic, but I think we're all aware that by now also like food prices are increasing across sub-Saharan Africa, with some countries being others. And in Nigeria in particular has been hit by a recession. And what we see here as a pattern, and I think that's important for the future, really that there are compounding crises that are affecting these populations. And like these crises are worse just because people are just coming from the COVID-19 pandemic. What we also see as a pattern in Uganda, and possibly related to the lockdown, is that mental health is actually something that respondents actually start reporting on more often over the course of the pandemic. What we see is that while initially mental health was only among the primary needs of like 9% of the respondents, it became 16% over time. I think we see this across the world where like because of the variety of lockdowns and the large effect the lockdowns had on Uganda, it's very well possible that mental health needs may have had like major implications in Uganda, and something to pay attention to in the future, especially because of all these choices and because of the large economic shocks. It's still quite visible to see how important mental health care is for these respondents. Our research focused really on savings groups, and like our respondents included savings group members. And these savings groups meet regularly under normal circumstances. But of course, because of COVID-19, savings groups also started being affected by social distancing. And what we see is, especially in the beginning, like in Uganda in particular, only 16% of the groups continued meeting as before COVID-19, and this only continued over time. In Nigeria, this was quite different. Like, still a majority of the groups continued meeting as before the pandemic. What happened in Uganda is that like the groups really adapted. They reduced their meeting duration. Some groups only met between the leaders. Some groups completely abandoned meetings, and other groups had less frequent meetings. And we still see this affecting the country right now. The and like this has like major implications, of course, also for the sustainability of savings groups in the country. What we also see, and this has implications for individual resilience, is that individual savings decreased in both countries. There was some recovery at the end of the survey. This is like an overview of the percentage of respondents who actually reported that they had fewer savings than before the pandemic. What we clearly see is that like this was like really high in both countries. There's a little bit of recovery from round 3 of the survey till round 4, and from round 1 to round 3 in Uganda. In Uganda, we only asked this survey question in round 1 and round 3 to limit the length of the survey. But clearly, people are still recovering, and there seems to be a need for additional support of some of the savings group members, considering that their savings have reduced considerably. Nonetheless, group savings continued throughout the pandemic. But we still see throughout the pandemic that they also decreased considerably. Again, like there is a little bit of recovery in both countries, especially in Nigeria, where like 26% of the groups in round 4 actually like say that there were no changes, while that was like only 10% in Uganda. This is consistent with the previous slides, where like the lockdown had major had implications in both countries, but more so in Uganda than in Nigeria. Some of this was compensated by increased access to credit, but ultimately there was also relatively limited. Approximately 1/3 of the sample obtained access to credit since March 2020. Though we must say here that like not all respondents actually also showed demand for credit. Like 46% of the respondents of the female members of a group didn't ask for a loan, and 15% in Nigeria, and 15% of the female members did not ask for a loan in Uganda. And this was 42% for men in Nigeria and 20% in Uganda. One feature of savings groups is that they have the ability to provide social funds. And those social funds were used as the savings groups to support members who were in difficulty. What we do see is that very clearly these social funds were used. And again, this was only asked in 2 survey rounds in Uganda and in 4 survey rounds in Nigeria. But what we do see is that the social funds, like the group members, they reported that this was used much more frequently in Nigeria than in Uganda, suggesting that Nigeria or Ugandan members may face some more challenge, or Nigerian members may have faced some more challenges, or alternatively, groups in Nigeria provided more support to their members. Of course, this social support, fund can actually improve individual resilience of members. But at the same time, like one thing that our study also showed that this can have major implications for group resilience. The social fund is used from the savings of savings group members. So if it's used too often, this may have like negative implications for the sustainability of groups, in which case they may require additional support. From here, I'm going to give the floor to Eve, who will discuss some of the key qualitative findings.
Thank you very much, Thomas. The screen looks a bit small. So I'll start off with the overarching comments about women's groups. And I'll say that women's groups found ways to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And at the beginning of the pandemic, most of the savings groups that are supported by CARE in Uganda suspended their meetings. And this was a time when many of us in the country didn't know how to respond or how to continue activity safely. And CARE encouraged groups with bank accounts to use mobile money to continue with their savings. And in a Vision Fund program in Uganda, it was noted that about 80% of the groups in refugee settlements continued to meet in small groups, while only 45% reported continuing to meet in groups among the host communities. And this may be explained by the fact that those in the camps live within proximity to each other, and they don't have to walk long distances to convene these meetings and conduct business. And CARE also reports that savings groups in Uganda started meeting again with strict adherence to the government of Uganda's standard operating procedures for conducting businesses and also holding gatherings amidst the pandemic. Next slide, please. So we also noted that groups patterned with communities to respond to the pandemic, and this was with the leadership positions of women. So at the beginning of the pandemic, as earlier noted, most group members suspended activities. And also CARE had encouraged some of them, especially those with bank accounts, to continue with their transactions via mobile money. So we note that members of savings groups contributed to and led responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm going to talk through some of the examples. For example, in Benin, Mali, and Niger, the groups contributed to community-level decision-making in responding to the pandemic. And then also, women were change agents from women's groups. And this case example comes from Women International. And they also shared recommendations on preventive behaviors. And also savings groups patterned in the response to the pandemic by producing masks and personal protective equipment. For example, in Nigeria, groups shifted to income-generating activities, and this included making and selling face masks. And women savings group members in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Mali are continuing to produce face masks for group members as well as marginalized populations in the country. Next slide, please. So while respondents did not observe significant changes in gender roles, our research found indications of increases in violence and financial stress among women. And in the qualitative interviews, the respondents noted several things. They highlighted issues of the lack of jobs and their men staying at home, and this affected household dynamics. The women reported stress, mostly about their household financial situation and their children's education. There were also issues of limited social interaction, particularly in the beginning phases of the pandemic, and this affected their social engagement and support systems. Then there were concerns around increased violence and arguments. Our qualitative respondents highlighted that there were increased arguments and fights between spouses in households, and these were mostly about money. And arguments often led to domestic violence, which ranged from emotional to physical abuse. And particularly in Uganda, they were escalating cases of early marriages and teenage pregnancies. And I have a quote from a female respondent in Nigeria to explain some of these situations. And this is it. My husband has not been a happy man because of our financial situation, and he was taking it out on the children and me. But things have improved. Now that he has started making some money, he's not as frustrated as he used to be. So now I hand over to my co-presenter, Tabitha. Over to you, Tabitha.
Thanks so much, Eve. My role is simple. It's to highlight outstanding conclusions from our study. And could I read, Thomas? Yes, please. Yes, some of the outstanding conclusions revolve around the heightened impact in the area of livelihoods and income losses. And for many respondents, these two represented needs, not merely wants, but needs. And the rates of the respondents, as a result of this, most respondents indicated that the highest risks they faced were also in the areas of livelihood and income loss. Most groups, VSL groups, adopted their meetings to the context in which they lived, as well as the procedures of the meetings as a result of the lockdown and the COVID context. And as a result, most of them were meeting. Can I read from my own presentation? Because I can see I can see. So could I just switch to what I have quickly? and I do this. Great. Most saving groups adopted their meetings and procedures to the COVID context, and seeing majority of them were resilient, and most groups continued to function and support their members through the COVID period. However, across the survey and the meetings and savings and loans, they across the groups, most meetings, savings and loans were disrupted and inconsistent. In the qualitative interviews, respondents highlighted market inflation as a key challenge they were currently facing. They indicated worsening livelihoods, indicating that unless support is provided, most groups are likely to continue with the adverse effects of the pandemic. Another conclusion is that majority women at individual level, but also at group level, generally their saving rates reduced. And this was due to the livelihood challenges mentioned earlier. And the overall conclusion is that saving rates were likely to remain low for many group members in the times to come. Some of the policy implications and recommendations revolve around groups. The fact that most saving groups in sub-Saharan Africa, including self-help groups, were likely contributed to individual resilience, but their group resilience may have suffered. Also, saving group members, especially in Nigeria and Uganda, saw their savings considerably decreasing after the COVID pandemic. And this indicates a need for intervention measures that may include cash transfers, the use of vouchers, and other social protection measures. This is mostly in the case of Uganda, where we see that most associations in Uganda did not continue after the pandemic, and instead we see that in Nigeria there was more persistence. That even after the lockdown, most groups continued to meet and were not as adversely affected as it was in Uganda. Of course, the impact of the COVID-19 in Uganda was graver, and a lot of people died, and the effects are much deeper. And so overall, we see that groups that continue to meet are more resilient, and a lot of them, on the other hand, although many survived, many of them also died out. At this point, I'd like to give over to Carl to come in with other ideas about this research that include data sharing and the use of the data at the different policy levels. To you, Carl.
All right. Thank you, Tabitha. And to our attendees, Elizabeth, Fatima, we forgot to say this at the beginning. There is a live Q&A option. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put the question there and we'll address it in a few minutes. So following what is being presented, I wanted to talk about two key things. One is around sharing data and making data available, and the other is using data to inspire actions. And one of the key work through the Women Respond initiative is making data and finding and learnings available. It was a critical part of Women Respond. We understand the importance of ensuring the availability of data and contributing to the gender data gap, but it's also important to share the data and making it available. Care shared finding within care internally and externally with different NGOs, government partners, and communities and VSLA members. The data is also available and accessible online. We have a data dashboard that could be accessed in the care.org, and it doesn't require any login, so it's publicly accessible, and people can actually go see the data dashboard and use the different filtering options. At the community level specifically, the findings were shared through community meetings, saving group meetings, and radios. And women community leaders, particularly VSLA women leaders, were very critical in disseminating and discussing the findings with VSLA groups and communities. And respondents said the results are helping them to see the bigger pictures and the impact of the pandemic, particularly for VSLAs. They're learning from other groups on how to adapt and manage their group function to continue. Next slide, please. And respondents are using the data, and we are seeing some promising action. For instance, in Nigeria, we've seen Village Saving and Loan Association. They started new businesses to support members who are financially vulnerable. So this was done, they wanted to make profit for their own group, but they wanted to identify some financially vulnerable group members. So they wanted to design some of the business activities so that they can support those. VSLA groups in Nigeria, some of them engaged in advocating for children not to drop out of school once they were encouraging people to send students, particularly girls. In Uganda, we've seen VSLA start using the data to advocate for women leaders in local government and to link VSLAs with government programs. We also see very inspiring government engagement using the data. We've seen in the case of Uganda where their national financial inclusion strategy, so they were taking some of the learning from this research. We've seen in some parts of like Nigeria where government partners were engaging in some of the campaigns to support VSLAs to advocate for girl students to go back to school. Within care, the data have been used in different programs to provide support, to add additional activities within existing projects, and to respond to women needs. And we are also using it in new proposals and in new programs. Results from the Women Respond also supported CARE's bold commitment in the Generation Equality Forum to invest on women and girls as leaders through saving and solidarity groups. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions or reflections, we can go ahead to address that. So Elizabeth, if you have any question, please feel free to put them on the discussion forum or the live Q&A.
Carl, I also wanted to reflect a little bit on like some of the use of the data by CARE, and maybe also in the context of the fact that, like, as we know, like COVID-19 will continue to be a concern, but at the same time, like possibly it's not the largest concern anymore in many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where concerns about rising food prices and supply chain concerns have taken over, alongside the fact that like climate change may, in like both now and in the future, like it is already causing major droughts across the Sahel as well as in various other settings in sub-Saharan Africa. Thinking of this, like how do you see like the Women Response initiative like responding to those kinds of compounding crises in the future? It would actually be really good to also think about, like, are you planning to continue to use data? Like, what is your current thinking there? You're mute, Carl.
COVID aspect. In the qualitative, particularly in the second round, we start asking what other crises are you facing, because we really wanted to understand some of it. And we've seen like, some of the findings, it is not yet analyzed and published yet, but we're seeing that in Nigeria, they mentioned around like security, food prices, and so on. Uganda, similarly, where they talk about, sometimes we have heavy rain or there's no rain at all, and talked about inflation and so on. As we move forward with Women Respond, we want to go beyond COVID. So the aim would be basically to understand whatever contextual specific shocks and crises communities and VSLAs are facing. So we are in the process of like adapting the tool to basically ask what is your major like priority shock or crisis that you're facing right now, and how is that affecting your life as an individual and in your households, and the VSLA aspect of it. So we wanted to continue to bring in data because we've seen like throughout this was particularly at the beginning, especially because we didn't have enough data, this was really critical. But as moving forward, we also know that the tools were in a way very limited because we were only focusing on COVID, while people were dealing with 1, 2, 3, or even more shocks and crises. So it's important to understand what they're facing and what they identify as the major shock and the major crisis in their lives and in their livelihood. So that's what we hope to do as the next phase of Women Respond. COVID is still going to affect because it has a huge lingering effect on the market, along with current ongoing climate change and security, both global and national level challenges. So we wanted to be able to adapt the tool to understand whatever crisis they're facing in their context, and we want them to be able to define it. There might be specific rapid gender analysis we do for specific crisis because that's integrated throughout our work. But for Women Respond, what's envisioning is for the people themselves to be able to identify this as like the main things that I'm facing right now, and this is how it is affecting me, and this is how I want to be supported.
Yes.
I'm also,
Also to
please go ahead,
sorry.
Tabitha.
Yes, I also want to add to what Carl is saying about the usage of the data. A big portion of the current savings group policy framework identifies COVID-19 and related shocks as one of the uh, key factors affecting savings group survival. And I hope that the final policy will reflect this as well, because there comes very strong recommendations around how to uh, help support saving groups to survive uh, such shocks as COVID-19, and fits well with the current shocks in Uganda, where we experience current concurrent shocks like droughts happening at the same time with floods in the same country. And as soon as the floods and droughts end, then comes in Ebola. So this kind of study is very essential in guiding further analysis on the impact of shocks.
Any additional thoughts, Eve, as well?
I also
Yes,
see question.
yes.
Wait, sorry. I see question
Yes.
on the chat. Elizabeth,
Okay.
this is
Let's
very
have the
interesting.
question.
Does care engage with women? Could you elaborate on that question? Do you want to know, like in general, how care engaged with women, or was your question specific to this research? Eve, over to you. Sorry, I just wanted to understand the question.
Would you be happy to first respond to the question, or I go ahead with my observation?
No, go ahead with your observation, because I asked for Elizabeth to like clarify on the question.
Yes.
And then I'll take from there.
Yeah, I think it would be useful finally to have a policy brief on best practices for forming and maintaining shock resilient savings groups, because these problems are always emerging and re-emerging in most African settings. We have pandemics like Ebola, diseases from zoonotic sources never end in Africa. They are seasonal and they never end, and the impact is massive in the affected regions of the continent. And then the other comment I wanted to make, when UMRA put out a statement that government will be starting to regulate some of these groups, there were mixed reactions from the population generally. I don't know, Tabitha, what are your thoughts on that? Is increased government involvement likely to be a positive thing, or it might turn tables around and negatively affect the good initiative, which was largely community-led?
Wow, great. We've been consistently attending the Uganda Microfinance Regulatory Authority meetings, and also helping them to draft and quality control on the guidelines for saving groups operations. But the government has consistently denied the fact that their regulation will not affect groups, individual groups at all. And we trust the government to say the truth.
I like
let's,
that.
let's trust the government, because there are a lot of undertones. Yeah, people are already suspecting. There are already certain insistence on certain actions by groups that might even lead to some of them completely winding up, like registration with the Uganda Revenue Authority,
Yeah.
and having the revenue payment number 13. Yes, and also insistence on having, for each group, having a bank account and registration with the authority. And the truth is that many of them, it's very expensive. It's a very expensive process to get registered, and also to consistently be under the radar of the URA, the Revenue Authority. It scares a lot of them. So there are those things, but we trust the government. Maybe they will come in gradually, but clearly they are laying a path for more presence.
And they've been known for mainstreaming things, and then they introduce certain taxes. Once the thing is formalized, it becomes a low-hanging fruit for them to milk. So that's why the public was very concerned.
Yes, it's too early to conclude, but I see the government eyeing a lot of tax revenue from the saving groups in the future.
Okay.
I do see in the Q&A also that Elizabeth clarified her question. I think you may want to, in general, do the groups have to register with CARE? And Carl, you may be able to answer that question best from our group.
All right. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So care work, women are at the center of everything we do. And VSLS is one of the signatory method process approach that we use to facilitate and empower participants to increase access and control over resource and use their collective power to overcome financial and economic barriers, but also social barriers, because it have a huge gender component, and we address social norms through that platform. So the way the VSLAs come to being, it's a self-selected group. So our role is facilitate the process. So we have community-based trainers or whoever is working on the ground. They work with community leaders, they work with community members, providing information about what Village Saving and Loan Association is, how the process work, what the advantages are, and so on. And people who want to be part of that, they register. They attend the training initially. So people can drop out, like even after the training, people can drop out, but usually it's 20 to 25 members. We usually, most of our VSLA members are almost 80% across the world are women mostly. Once they take the training, they, manage the group. But the first cycle, which is usually 12 months, it could be a bit more sometimes, depending on how well they're doing. Throughout those 12 months, there is different trainings of the VSLA manual. And support and follow up from either care or partner that's working on the ground. But it's completely selected. So they have to want to be able to be part of the group, and they also manage the group. But in the first year, they get different trainings and follow-up support. We do have basic information about them, like name, phone number, location, and so on. That's how we are able to contact them even after they, start managing the group by themselves. So as for instance, in this research, we went through our database and contacted different VSLA members, some of them who are part of our active programs and some of them who are not in some of the countries. And so we do have those information, but it's self-managed and self-governed group. But CARE will have like basic information. Does that answer your question, Elizabeth? All right.
Yeah. They seems to be happy with the rest.
Great. It would actually be really interesting if, Tabitha, you were already mentioning like the role of the government, but traditionally savings groups in Uganda have of course been supported by NGOs. Like, how do you see the role of the government evolving? You already spoke a little bit about that. That will be good to learn a little bit more about your perspective, maybe on Uganda specifically, but also, Carl, if you have some insights in other countries as well, might be useful. Any thoughts there?
Let me say, for the case of Uganda, the government is increasing its presence by intentionally putting aside money through the Ministry of Finance to directly finance these groups and broaden access to government funds through different programs. And we all know that when the government gives, it takes away with the other hand. So it's not merely coincidence that the government is now interested in having a savings group policy, and is also very interested in for instance, researchers like this one and the one that did the census on the number of women groups and the different types. And this is very interesting for them now as they are rolling out the parish development model, which is also revolving around saving groups. And so it's a key government strategy to address issues of poverty, but also to bringing saving groups into the formal economy. And that is where the problem is. The intention is to broaden the tax base. When you say you join the formal economy, you definitely there is the need to broaden the tax base, and there is potential in tapping into saving groups to raise money for the government there.
Any additional thoughts there? Carl? You're on mute, Carl.
Oh, sorry. No, you can do a bit of a reflection from the point of like ECWG. What is like some of, particularly considering shocks like COVID and ongoing market disruption, particularly around food prices? What is the research agenda would look like in the near future?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and we have done a lot of research on women's groups in COVID-19, both in Nigeria and Uganda, but also in India and South Asia. And like in India, like self-help groups are a massive movement, very like a lot of government supports. Like Africa is moving, like various settings in Africa are moving toward that model, but like what we increasingly see is indeed like with the large number of shocks that do exist, that it becomes increasingly important for people to, like for group members to mitigate some of the negative economic consequences of those shocks. We've seen that women's groups and like savings groups and other women's groups can mitigate some of those negative economic consequences of COVID-19. At the same time, groups themselves have been negatively affected. And with the compounding crises that are currently happening, I think it's going to be really important to examine the longer term effects of these shocks, both on members but also on groups, considering that we see that groups can mitigate some of these negative economic consequences. It's likely important to like provide additional support in the wake of these crises, knowing that they actually otherwise their sustainability is really in danger, and like group resilience may be a big challenge. But with additional support, groups may continue to function. But like it's clear that we need to do more research on that, like examining like how groups can continue to function and how they can support their members during these different crises. Like social distancing is probably less of a concern with some of these crises, but at the same time, like food prices are like a real concern, and like how does that affect the savings rates also of group members? So that's just like some thinking around that. I also recognize we're over time. Thanks to the audience for attending, and thanks Tabitha, Carl, and Eve for joining the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so
Bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So,
Thank you.